As I'm sure everyone here remembers, in the summer of 2009, these three Americans were hiking in Iraqi Kurdistan, accidentally crossed over into Iran, and were captured by a border patrol. Accused of espionage, they spent a very long time in prison, 14 months for Sarah and 2 years for Josh and Shane. In their new memoir, they tell their incredible story in a really remarkable way. They alternate relaying their versions of what was happening and present a compelling and really beautifully written account of the horrors of imprisonment and the triumph of willpower and their own value systems. Shane Bauer is an award-winning investigative journalist and photographer whose work has appeared in Mother Jones, The Nation, Salon, and many other publications. Joshua Fattal is an historian with a background in environmental economics and policy and has been an activist and an organizer focused on sustainable development. And Sarah Shourd is a writer, educator, contributing editor at Solitary Watch and has focused her human rights advocacy work on prisoners' rights. They are joined by Chanan Tigay, journalist and creative writing professor at San Francisco State University. So please join me in welcoming them to our stage.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Why don't I point out first who's who, since there's so many people on the stage, so you know who's talking. I'm Chanan Tigay. That's Josh. That's Shane. And you probably guessed that was Sarah sitting right there. So, I met Sarah Shourd in December of 2010 at an event not entirely dissimilar to this one. We were sitting up on a stage, and I was asking Sarah questions, and she was answering them. The major difference is that these two gentlemen were not there at the time. They were both in prison in Iran, and it was a fundraising event where we were trying to raise money to help get these guys out of prison. So this is a much different event and a much happier one, and so I just want to say welcome. It's nice that you're all three here this time. I'm going to ask some questions, and then interspersed with the questions, each of these folks is going to read a little bit from one of their sections in the book so you get a sense of it. But just so you know, the book is really riveting and really wonderful. And you'll get a sense of that as we go along. So let's begin at the beginning. Josh, when I first began to hear about the American hikers imprisoned in Iran in 2009, and we started getting a little bit of information about who each one of you was, I remember thinking to myself, what in God's name is a nice Jewish boy doing hiking in Iraqi Kurdistan in 2009? Can you tell us what you were all doing there, and and what happened exactly?
You and my mom would be good friends. Well, I told my mom. I said, I'm going to Syria. Shouldn't be a problem. And she said, Syria? You've been to the Middle East, but you've only been to Israel. And I said, I've told people in Syria, I met their friends, and they're interested in me as a Jew, and it's fine. But she's like, but they're not Jewish. Like, your friends aren't Jewish. They don't know. And I said, don't worry. So I was there visiting them after teaching on a university program in 2009, and then Sarah had a week off of work, so we decided to take a little trip, and we went to Iraqi Kurdistan, which they had known some other people that went there. They had come back, I remember, to the apartment that they were staying, and they said it was beautiful, and the mountains were beautiful, and this and that. So we went to Iraqi Kurdistan. I remember, actually, the first guy we met in Iraqi Kurdistan was at a hotel in the city of Erbil, and I remember the smell of the place smelled very much like my Israeli family's kitchen. It was this sort of Arabic food that my Israeli family is from Iraq, and it had this sort of pickled mango, they call it amba, that is very familiar. And then I remember the hotel manager, he sat us down, he said, oh, we don't get many Americans. We get a lot of Europeans, but not so many Americans. And he sat us down, and he kind of very friendly. We were like all on a couch, and he like grabbed my leg, kind of in the exact way that my father sometimes grabs my leg. This kind of cordial way that I guess is Middle Eastern cultural way. And he said, I love George Bush, and I love Israel. And I was kind of like, wow, welcome to Iraq. So that was the first impression. So for people who don't get what is northern Iraq and Kurdistan, it is very pro-American, kind of more pro-American than I am in some ways. And then we decided to go hiking, and we asked the hotel guy and the taxi guy, and they both said the same thing. So we went to Ahmedabad, and the issue was we didn't realize Ahmedabad was so darn close to the border, and so when we hiked past the waterfall, we found that out.
And that's when you got into so much trouble. There's a question in the book. It seems that you were, in fact, called over to that side of the border. In other words, you had no intention. Not only did you not know Iran was there, but if you did, you certainly would have gone. On the other hand, these Iranian guards called you over. Did you ever get a sense of why they called you over there to begin with? Were they deliberately luring you there, or is there something else at play?
Well, we were kind of out in the middle of nowhere, you know. I mean, we had hiked many hours up this valley, and they were surprised to see us. We were surprised to see them, you know. I think they were standing on this ridge. They saw these three people and, you know, just reacted. Said, come here, what are you doing here? So then asked for our passports, saw we were American, and called their boss, and their boss told them to bring us in, and it just kind of went from there.
Interesting. Shane, would you mind reading us a little bit from the book? Thanks.
So this is about 2 days in. We had been kind of passed off from one group to the next in western Iran. We didn't know where we were, what city we were in. We were taken to an apartment building where different people kept coming in and interrogating us pretty poorly. One guy, actually the day before, had asked Josh to prove that he was American by spelling supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. And it was ridiculous, and it's funny now, but those questions actually weren't funny then, because it just made it seem just so... just the randomness was kind of frightening. So we were in this apartment, and at nighttime, after dark, we're put in a car and driven out of the city. "He's got a gun," Josh says, startled but calm. "He just put it on the dash." In a busy roundabout, our car swerves to avoid an oncoming vehicle. The pistol falls from the dash and scuds across the floor. My heart stops and my mouth goes dry. The pudgy man picks it up and sets it on his lap. We turn onto a road that leads out of town. The city lights fade behind us. "Where are we going?" Sarah asks in a disarming, honey-sweet voice. "Sssss," the pudgy man hisses, turning around to face us and putting his finger to his lips. The headlights of the car trailing us light up his face, revealing his cold, bored eyes. He turns back to face the front. The solitary lights of the country houses stream by like little meteorites. The car falls silent again. He picks up the gun in his right hand and cocks it 3 times. Sarah's eyes widen. Her posture stiffens. She leans toward the man in front and, with a note of desperation, says, "Ahmadinejad good, Obama bad." The pistol is resting on his lap. He turns to face us again and holds his 2 hands out with palms facing each other. "Iran," he says, nodding his head towards one hand. "America," he says, lifting the other. "Problem," he says, stretching out the distance between them. He checks our faces to make sure his message registered, then drops his arms. Sarah turns to me and starts. What does she see? Her eyes are penetrating. "Do you think he's going to hurt us?" she asks. I don't know whether to respond or just stare at her. I'm terrified. We walk into our fear together, letting it surround us softly like a fog. The immediate prospect of death seems so different than I had imagined it. In my mind, I see us pulling over to the side of the road and leaving the car quietly. My tremulous legs will convey me mechanically over the rocky earth. I will be holding Sarah's hand, and maybe Josh's too, but I will be mostly gone already, walking flesh with no spirit. We won't kiss passionately in our final moments before the trigger pull. We won't scream. We won't run. We won't utter fabulous words of defiance as we stare down the gun barrel. We will be like mice, paralyzed by fear, limp in the slack jaw of a cat. We will just stand there. Each of us will fall, one by one, hitting the gravelly earth with a thud.
Thanks, Shane. I often tell my writing students that in order to keep readers engaged in a book, So you've got to have the larger narrative arc of the story, which in your case is your desire to become free. But in addition to that, you need to have obstacles and hurdles along the way that your characters need to meet and ideally overcome, or in some cases fail. And I think you do a really beautiful job in this of portraying the daily struggles that you faced when you were in prison, these daily smaller hurdles that you would overcome. So whether it was trying to make sure that Sarah was no longer kept in solitary confinement, which lasted the entirety of your time there, or whether it was simply you two guys trying to figure out how to make the best prison wine. There were little obstacles you had to overcome all the way. And I wonder if, Sarah, if you could begin by telling us just what was daily life like in Evin prison?
That's probably the hardest question that we get, because 410 days, even in prison, every day is different. And of course, there was kind of an arc to the time that I spent there. In the beginning, you're just kind of flailing. The closest metaphor I can make is like if someone just puts you into a space capsule and sends you out into space, and you have no connection to the ground, no radio contact. Shane and I, the first month, we were celled next to each other, so we discovered we could talk through a vent, so we could orient each other to some degree. But then after that, in solitary confinement, you get reduced to an almost animal-like state. I would spend hours and hours just pacing compulsively in my cell. I would crouch down by the slot in my cell door, the food slot, for hours just listening for sounds from the outside to orient myself. A cough or a footstep would remind me that I'm still in the world of the living. I broke down many times and almost, lost touch with myself. At one point I heard screaming, and I thought it was another prisoner in another, maybe in the next row of cells, and I just wanted it to stop, so I put my hands over my ears, and the guards burst into my cell and started shaking me, and I realized I'd been screaming. So that's how the beginning, the intensity, but there, like I said, there's an arc. You begin to adjust, and you learn how to resist the dehumanization around you. So anything that makes you feel human keeps you sane, keeps you alive. I would sing at the top of my lungs. Other prisoners would clap down the hallway and sing back at me. They would sing English songs like Michael Jackson, "You Are Not Alone." I would dance. I would see how many times I could do pirouettes across the 10 feet of my cell. Got up to 17 at one point.
Impressive.
I would add to that the challenge in writing a book about prison is, I would say that most of life in prison was incredibly boring. And it's just like every day, I think most days are identical. And, when you tell a story is filled with events. And it's this challenge of trying to capture an experience that is just, in many ways, kind of fundamentally empty, by shaping it around events, which is in some ways not true to the actual experience. But nobody's going to want to read that,
Right, and I think one of the ways you do it is by focusing so much on the relationship between the three of you. Was that a very conscious decision going into writing the book? Did you say, there are a couple of things at play here. One is we all know how it turns out, right? So everyone picking the book up knows that you guys got out. Yeah. So it's not a mystery in that sense. And as you say, 400 odd days, it gets boring at some point. So going into it, did you say, how in God's name are we going to make this interesting?
I would say that wasn't a conscious choice, that the relationships, that our bond was just unbreakable. I remember at times there was a period where Josh was encouraging Shane and I to spend a little time alone because, we're in a relationship for years before this, and the little time we had together every day, Josh noticed, he was like, "Sarah, I think you need to be alone with Shane." And I said, there is no Sarah and Shane. There's only the three of us. Like, we were just, a unit. And it was also relationships with other prisoners. The relationships were what defined our experience. And
interestingly, you would develop these relationships with people who on the outside, the likelihood of you being friends with were very dim, I would imagine. Members of Al-Qaeda, for example.
Right, yeah. There was a time that Josh and I, Sarah had been out of prison, and we were trying to get our hair cut, and we were asking for days, and eventually someone came with a razor, and they took us to this little cell that is kind of has an open ceiling, and it's next to a bathroom, and there's a window that connects the cell to the bathroom, and this is where prisoners go to shower. And while I'm cutting Josh's hair, we hear a shower turn on in the bathroom, so we knock on the window, and this guy opens the door, and he's standing there, buck naked, and we just start talking. There's no guards around. So he says, are you Sarah's husband, and is she free? And he says, I ask him, why he's there, and he says, I'm Al Qaeda, just matter of fact, and he's like, but he was from the mountains where we were actually captured, and he said, everyone knows you guys are innocent, you shouldn't be here. And then he asked what my religion is and what Josh's religion is. And he says, okay. I tell him I'm Christian, even though I'm not really, but it's the easiest thing to say. And Josh tells him he's Jewish, and he says, okay, people of the book, we're all, one people, but if you convert to Islam, you'll sleep better at night. Like his conversion attempt. And, and in the end, he just said, I hope you get free. And I think that interaction really captured for me something kind of essential about that place, which was we're all, we're in a political prison. They immediately divide everyone. There's no common area. People are separated because, these are people who organize. They're pro-democracy activists. This, a couple of people from Al Qaeda. But as soon as we're in there, those kind of identities are not as important as our identities as prisoners. And there's prisoners and there's guards, and it's like there's just instant solidarity, amongst the prisoners. We walk down the hall, tipping our head back to see under the blindfold, and you see guys like in their cell just looking out, giving the victory sign,
Yeah, that's fascinating. So let's touch a little bit on this issue of identity. We're coming on Passover, which is a holiday about freedom. And I think religion plays an important role in your discussion of your incarceration. And Josh, in particular, Judaism plays a dual role for you, I think. One is initially you're frightened that folks there are going to find out that you're Jewish. But then the second thing is that though you're not observant on the outside, somehow as your incarceration goes on, you start to observe Shabbat, for example, and fast on Yom Kippur. You start these sort of outward rituals of Judaism. Can you talk a little bit about the role your being Jewish played for you during your incarceration?
Yeah, I can. We were put into a 30 by 30 foot courtyard, larger cell, like 2 times a day, half hour each. And when the first 4 months, we were all in there alone at different times during the day. And I kind of remember this one time that I was, I got myself it's hard to get motivated in solitary confinement, but I got myself motivated to jog around in that cell. And I kind of just had this feeling like, all right, I had this feeling of history, this feeling of, okay, people, my ancestors, people have been through hard stuff. I can get through hard stuff. Come on, keep going. And kind of like almost this force from my back, like pushing me forward. And I felt that, I was so scared to tell the interrogators and to tell the guards, and they'd ask, what's your religion? It's kind of like a common question. And the interrogators were very interested. And they found out within the first couple of weeks that I was Jewish. But I withheld that I was in Israel 4 years ago, and that I was actually there just 2 years ago. And it was hard for me then, and then I admitted it later. And then I kind of had this feeling of I'm feeling guilty just because of how I was born. And I was like, why am I doing this? So I just, almost in a reaction to that, I became more Jewish than I ever been before in my life in Iranian prison. So it's like, okay, I'm gonna be Jewish, the best is the way I know. So I tried to watch the moon through it's only you could see the moon 4 days a month for 2 hours in the angle of the cell, the angle of the window in the cell. And then I was like, okay, so this must be when Rosh Hashanah, it's new moon, and trying to track that stuff. And so I had this phase where I was like, all right, I'm keeping kosher. Every Saturday, I'm gonna not clean my floor, because that was something that took up 15 minutes, and anything to take up 15 minutes is relief in solitary confinement. I had one plate, a metal plate, and I didn't clean it on Saturday. I was like dirty on Saturday, but it made me feel like I belonged to something greater than myself, and that's what you need in solitary confinement. And also made me feel connected to my family, which was kind of they're always wanting me to celebrate more holidays than I was, so I felt more connected to them by doing that. And let me just say too, it was interesting to me at the time, like how the guards in particular would interpret. Because the word started to get out, like, oh, there's this Jewish guy. And so when I was in a cell with Shane, or at the courtyard with Shane and Sarah, the guards would point to me and they'd say, "You Jewish," and then they'd point to them and they'd say, "Christian," and then they point to themselves. And this is like almost every guard would do this. This is like a very common reaction. They say, "Muslim, me Muslim," and they say, "One God." Sort of that people of the book kind of thing. The other thing that like all the guards said, which makes me realize like there's some common education around Judaism and Christianity and Islam, was that they'd say, "Jew, no problem. Jew, no problem. Israel, problem."
In that light, I shudder to think what they would have made of the fact that you went to the same high school in Philadelphia as Bibi Netanyahu. Is Cheltenham High.
I didn't tell him that one.
You didn't mention that. Sarah, a related question for you. After your release, a man on your flight from Dubai to the United States gave you a gift of a watch. And on the box, there was a note attached that said, "From a fellow American citizen with love." And at that point in the book, you say that you've never felt so American in your life. So why was that?
That's a great question. Well, I think I spent, 13 and a half months longing for my country, dreaming of seeing American soil again. And I'm still not, I wouldn't describe myself as patriotic because I'm not a nationalistic type of I don't have that sort of worldview. But I love my country. Something I write about in the book that I thought about a lot in prison was when I was 6 years old, after my mom and dad split up and my mom got custody, we drove across the country from Chicago to LA because we were moving. We put everything in the car, the cat and our few possessions, and just seeing this country for the first time, from Zion to the Grand Canyon. When I got to the Grand Canyon, I just ran up to the edge and I could feel my mom's fear, but I just didn't let it stop me because I just was overwhelmed by wonder. That's what I thought about when I was in prison. And I also thought about, our incredible history of resistance, fighting for civil rights, what an international, diverse country we are. I longed for it. So I think it was all of that. And coming home, it's like this last 2.5 weeks, we've been on book tour. We've been all over the country. And coming back to Oakland, I see it through fresh eyes. And I'm just so happy to be home. And it was like that times 10,000.
And also, the way you described when you got home, all of a sudden you were sort of a celebrity. I mean, people actually just recognized you and came up to you and handed you gifts like this. I imagine that it was a difficult time to get back, coming from where you were. On the other hand, did that soften the blow somewhat?
Did it soften the blow? Yes. Yes, definitely. When I came back, especially coming straight out of solitary confinement, onto the first week, Oprah, and then meeting President Obama, and then meeting President Ahmadinejad, Hillary Clinton, et cetera, shocking. It was total shock to the system. And I think the fact that I did feel a lot of support and love everywhere. I mean, they had people come up to me and give me flowers in the street, tears in their eyes. It also mediated some of the negative stuff I was reading online, which is nice.
Yeah, good. Josh, would you read a little bit for us? Thanks.
This passage I'm about to read happens right after we had a visit with our mothers we had, it was about 9 months into prison. Our mothers got to spend 2 afternoons with us, and it was sort of wild to be so isolated from the world and have these moments with our mothers that were, being videotaped and tapped, but being able to like feel them and hold them. And I just remember wanting to like, knowing that they had launched this international and extremely powerful campaign for us, just wanting to like give them and just being able to like just pour a glass of water, being able to like peel an orange for my mother and tell her like what she meant to me just was fantastic. It was being used as propaganda by the Iranian media. But I also just remember when we said goodbye, we were like on an elevator and just saying goodbye as the elevator doors closed between us, not knowing when we'd see each other again. And it was this just very emotional moment. And then, we get thrown into a van and ride back to Evin prison. And on that ride back, I'm holding a bag of books and letters and photos that my mother's handed us, and I'm kind of just like sorting through it, like don't even know what I'm looking for. I'm just like bathing in love. Like I haven't felt anything like this for so long. And then the van turns sharply to the left, and all the letters and photos and books spew to the floor. The vehicle comes to a stop. I step out. A dozen guards stand around a volleyball net in a parking lot next to the entrance of Section 209 of Evin prison. I recognize all the guards. One of the guards jogs over to me, and for a moment I think he's going to invite me to play, because this guard kind of likes me, and sometimes this rapport allows me a little bit of leeway, but he pushes me forward. He wants me blindfolded and inside the prison's walls. When the other guards see what's happening, the rest of the volleyball court erupts in commotion, everyone arguing in Farsi. And then the guard we named AK, short for ass kicker guard, runs towards me. He carries the ball in his hands, grabs my forearm, pulls me onto the court, and hands me the volleyball. And it's so characteristic of this place of this upside-down place, that the guard who often jokes with me and is friendly, he acts tough in front of his peers and pushes me towards the prison. Meanwhile, AK, who earns his reputation by beating prisoners, invites me to play. I brush these thoughts aside, grab the ball, stride as confidently as I can to the server's line. I bounce the ball a couple times. I look at my teammates. I look at my opponents. They're all waiting on me. The ball's in my hands. A package of ballpoint pens that my mother gave me is hidden in my underwear. Clouds drift above us. The snow-capped mountains loom majestically just beyond the prison, and I savor this moment of power. My serve descends deep onto the left side. They bump the ball out of bounds, our point. I'm content to walk off the court to sounds of approval. Immediately, inside prison, they take Sarah upstairs and Shane and I to the changing room. Before we enter, a guard empties our pockets and takes that bag of letters and photos and books. And I just want to carry that feeling of being in my mother's arms with me back to my cell. I want to cherish all that she gave me and to remember the warmth that exists in the world. But no, they take everything. Everything except the 4 pens hiding in my underpants.
Thanks. Shane, the book describes a really interesting process. When you first are put in prison, you have no idea how long you're going to be there. And there's even some comment about, when we get out tonight and we tell our friend Sean about this crazy day we had. Yeah. And it only gradually, over the course of time, begins to dawn on you all that you might actually be here for quite a while. That happens, I think, for one of you guys at 6 months and another one at about 8 months. Can you talk about that progression, sort of how your view of your incarceration developed over the course of time?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is just kind of denial, from the very beginning. It's like you never want to think that you're going to be in prison for a long time. So, when I remember at one point in my interrogation, after the first interrogation, the interrogator asked me what I was doing, in Iraq, and tells me to write my complete biography. And then at the end, I'm kind of like, all right, so we're done now. So, you see that this is all cleared up. you know what we're doing here, so do we get to go home? And he was like, said something about another week, and I was just outraged, you know. And then later, you know, months later, the three of us would see each other out in this courtyard, and we had TV after a while, an Iranian state TV, and we would see bits of news, and we would just analyze it, you know. Every little bit of information, we had this little three-person world, and we tossed these bits of information around, and they'd be spun into some other meaning, you know, something about the nuclear talks, you know, it could be anything, but we would never guess how much longer we were going to be there, you know. That was like the only thing that was kind of off limits in an unspoken way. I mean, every once in a while, I remember Sarah asking, like, you know, a couple times, how long do you think it could be? And it was just like, we're not going to answer that one, you know. I remember you saying you grabbed your toothbrush. Oh, yeah. No, in the beginning, when we were still in interrogation, we were transferred from one part of Evin prison to another part. And I was in this hall in solitary confinement, and I heard Sarah's voice. And I got up. As soon as I heard it, I got up and I grabbed my toothbrush, because I thought, you know, I'm getting out of here. I need to, like, make sure I can brush my teeth when I go. And I put it in my pocket and just waited at the door. And then I found out that she was actually in a cell across from me, and I was hearing her sing. So there was a while where we were on that cell together, and I would whistle songs out into the hall. And whistling is nice because the guards you can never tell who's whistling. It's not like a voice, you know? So I could whistle, and they'd just say, shut up, and, you know, no one would get punished for it.
And you even used your whistling to sort of send messages to each other, right? If you whistled a particular song and meant something specific, what was that about?
Yeah, we had we decided on songs that would signal, after Josh and I were put in a cell together. Sarah was always fairly close to the courtyard, so she could hear us sing out there. And if we had been suddenly separated, we're always like imagining scenarios in the future and what to do if certain things happen. So if we're separated, you know, we had one song that meant that we were hunger striking, you know, one song that meant that Josh and I had been separated, and we kind of developed this code language that we also shared with our families when they came. You know, we used actually Bob Dylan songs a lot as kind of code words. Like if we referenced The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, which was a song about this kind of miscarriage of justice, that meant that we were on hunger strike. And we actually used that one time when we got to call them.
Yeah, amazing. Now, as it turns out, you're not the only Californians ever to have been imprisoned in Evin prison. According to Wikipedia, so it must be true. Someone named Dariush Zahedi, who was a professor at UC Berkeley, where you all attended, was imprisoned there in 2003 for a short while, and someone named Esha Momeni, a student at Cal State Northridge, was held there starting October 15th, 2008. In any case, despite the California connection, it's a notorious place. And I'm wondering if you had ever heard of Evin prison before you were incarcerated there, Sarah.
No, I never had.
You hadn't?
Absolutely not.
So, Josh, shortly after you were transferred there, a Belgian prisoner approaches you and through the door of your cell tells you that he heard about you on the BBC, and you guys have now received the moniker the Hikers, or the American Hikers. As far as I could tell from the book, that was the first confirmation you had that anyone on the outside actually knew where you were, what had happened to you. What was it like to learn that after all that time that you hadn't been forgotten?
It was significant. It was very significant. There was kind of these dual voices in my mind. I mean, I knew that we were on the border. Shane was able to make a phone call to our friend who didn't go on the hike with us. But at the same time, I kind of, had no confirmation that anybody knew. I was worried like my family didn't even know. And this guy runs to he's going to the bathroom, so he has to pass my cell. And he quickly puts up his blindfold, darts to my door and says, "Are you one of the hikers?" Because he had heard me speak English. And I was like, what the heck is a hiker? And he was like, "Well, you were hiking when you were arrested." And I was like, "Yeah, I was hiking when I was arrested." He's like, "Well, I saw you on BBC. They call you guys the hikers." And so I was like, "Okay, well, we're on BBC. I mean, that's huge." I didn't. That was huge. And, soon thereafter, my neighboring cell, they had a television in their cell before we got televisions, before I had one in my cell. And they turned up the volume really loud when there was like an English program. And I remember hearing the voice of Hillary Clinton saying, there is no evidence that these people are in espionage. And then the volume slowly turned down. And I pounded on the wall next to them to thank them that they had, just so that I had known, I had gotten some information that people on the outside were talking about us or knew about it. But let me just add one more thing about that Hillary Clinton thing, because later we found I remember the Omani envoy came, and Oman was the one that negotiated our release and was the intermediary between the U.S. and the Iranian government. And I remember once he visited us, and he sat us down and gave us like fancy gifts while the interrogators are kind of like over our shoulders and watching everything we do. And he said, Hillary, she keeps saying things, and every time she says something, it means you guys are going to be in prison. The Iranians won't if they
demands in particular.
Yeah, she's saying release you guys, and she's making demands. And if she makes demands, the Iranians they want to save face. They don't want to look soft on America. So every time she says something, that means you guys will be here in a few more months. So
that's not helpful. Sarah, you also had an experience where someone approached you and had heard of you on the outside and actually told you, I love you, Sarah, a woman named Zahra. And I think you were going to read something about your relationship with this other prisoner. If you'd go ahead and do that, that'd be great.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you.
So most of the time, for months on end in my corridor in the women's section of the political prison, it would be completely quiet. All you'd hear, it was almost like being in a mental ward. You'd hear people crying, moaning, banging on their doors, but not much commotion. So as you mentioned in the introduction, in 2009, Iran saw the largest protest for democracy and human rights since the Islamic Revolution in '79. All the capitals erupted in huge protests. The Green Movement was born, and of course, thousands of people were picked up and thrown into prison. When we were arrested about 3 months later, and we assumed that the people around us, and we found out slowly that they were all oppositionists and human rights lawyers, student activists, but we assumed that the Green Movement had died down. And little did we know that that was not the case. So on December 27th, the Ashura protests erupted, and I had some kind of a intimation that they were coming. I just felt a tension from the guards. There was a new box at the end of the hallway that I snuck a peek into, and it was full of new uniforms and sandals, and I just felt that, and I heard helicopters also circling all day long. And on December 27th, the streets of Tehran were brought to us. So the prison exploded with new people. There were women coming down my hall with bloody heads. They'd been beaten. They'd fresh off the streets. People were angry and screaming. And a new woman was put in the solitary cell next to mine. Most of the other cells in the hallway had 10 or 12 people packed in. And the woman next to my cell, whenever there was a new woman in solitary, they would be having a horrible time the first few days, crying, beating at the walls, trying to get me to talk to them. And at the time, I was opposed to talking to other prisoners because I'd been caught, and I didn't want to be caught again, and I was afraid I was going to lose my time with Shane and Josh. So I would sort of sit on my hands and just clench my jaw and try to resist. So I'm sitting in the corner of my cell. Sarah! I suddenly hear a soft whisper. The voice is close, almost as if it were in my cell. Sarah! My head darts to the left and right, looking for the source of the sound. Am I imagining it? Sarah! The voice is louder now. Please! It seems to be coming from the corner near the door where my sink is. Above the sink is a vent. The vent. As soon as the thought crosses my mind, I leap off my bare mattress, compelled by a force beyond my control, and climb onto the sink. I press my mouth to the vent. Who are you? I ask. How do you know my name? My name is Zahra, almost the same as yours, Sarah. I know you. You know me? Yes, I saw your mother on TV. I'm so sorry for you, Sarah. I'm a mother too. Did you talk to my mother? I'm almost yelling now. Then I remember to hush. Did you talk to her? As soon as the question escapes my mouth, I realize how irrational it is. No, Sarah, but I saw many pictures of you on BBC. You're a small, beautiful girl. I know it must be easy for you to be standing on the sink. For me, it is difficult. They beat me. They kicked me and tortured me. My hips hurt, and it is difficult for me to stand. Her English is almost perfect, strongly accented with a sensuous, scratchy quality. I try to imagine her, hurt and alone, being taken every day for beatings and interrogation and then put back in a cage, separated from her children, her life. So much like me, I think, but as bad as my situation is, Zahra's is worse. Why did they arrest you? I asked. I was at the protest, she said. Ashura. Suddenly, the door of my cell bursts open. A guard's small, voluptuous silhouette is outlined in the doorway with her hands on her hips. She must have heard us talking and crept down the hallway, probably shoeless so we wouldn't hear her footsteps, and pounced on us in the middle of our forbidden conversation. It felt like being caught masturbating by a ruthless schoolmarm, like discovering a private secret pleasure and then being exposed and humiliated. This time my pleas have no effect. The guard's kind, motherly face slams shut like a steel door. She says she'll tell my interrogators what I've done. Zahra, the new prisoner, is immediately transferred.
Thank you. One of the things that comes up throughout the book is for the three of you, is your criticism of the United States policies in the Middle East as well as Israeli policies. And in this way, you seem to feel some kind of kinship, actually, with your guards. You were political prisoners in the odd situation of actually agreeing with your captors about fundamental issues of politics. Josh, I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, and then if either the other two you wants to touch on that and answer the question, did being in Iranian prison actually change any of those attitudes?
It changed it in us.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was this just... The whole equation from day one was we have an American passport, therefore we are the American government. And that was something I contested from day one. My government is something I vote for, but it doesn't have my opinions exactly, and it often does things that I don't like. The war in Iraq is a great example. We all had, opposed it in different ways, and but the U.S. government did it, and so I felt like helpless in that sense to be able to I had to detach myself from the U.S. government in terms of that was what I was being punished for, and so they were trying to make that equation, and the reason they were making that equation is because they see themselves from 1979 as this sort of Islamic revolution happening against their monarch, who had been a king, and who was a corrupt king. And when they overthrew that turned them into this sort of like radically anti-American group, gang that runs the country of Iran. And so I felt, I think it's really unfair. I think I would very much not say I agree with my captors in the sense that the way they think is you're with Iran or you're with America. It's like the American government versus, it's very much like Bush logic. And but from the Iranian side, and you're on one side, and so when they saw my American passport, then I'm on the American side. And I think what we do, and what I feel proud about us for doing in the book and even in prison, was saying like, no, there's the governments have been in this hostile relationship for decades, and we, we're not that. I'll speak for myself, but I'm not that. And I feel like, U.S. trying to isolate Iran, trying to, have wars on both their neighbors and constantly threatening them with war is a stance that led them to retaliate by taking us. And so it's like, okay, well, before I was born, now these two governments are in this, Cold War of sorts, and I get taken as retaliation for that. So I kind of felt, and just even talking about Hillary and stuff, felt like, sure, the new administration in the U.S. and now the new administration in Iran are trying to come up with some common ground, but they're working against these decades of history that are, and really continuing, and it's not being undone that quickly, of hostility that we got caught in the middle of.
Can I just add to that? It wasn't possible to have nuanced conversations with the guards. Little Arabic I knew, and some of them knew, and then the sort of prison Farsi that I learned, all I knew how to say was, "Can I go to the bathroom?" and "Where's my lawyer?" But I did with my interrogator, and I think that the first month, my interrogator really convinced me that he was on my side, and that he knew I was innocent, that I was a really good person, and he flattered me a lot. He definitely played up the good cop role. And I at first was kind of drawn in by it. He gave me extra books. He let me see pictures of my family. He made me all these promises about court and a phone call and freedom. And I came to realize that even though we'd have political conversations, religious conversations, conversations about poetry, where it just seemed like we had so much in common, this man was working in a political prison. His actions spoke much louder than any words that he could possibly say. He was participating not only in my torture, my psychological torture, but the torture of so many, and execution, the horrible things that happened there. So really, I think this answers your question in a way. Political ideology, religious ideology, these are all things that you can hide behind, but your actions, you can't.
Can I add something to that too?
Please.
Well, first of all, I would definitely not. I would say that I would have never seen myself in kind of kinship with the Iranian government, or really any government probably. But there's just one example that I think illustrated the kind of position we were in. Throughout our imprisonment, Guantanamo Bay came up a lot, and I remember when I was in solitary confinement, I would complain to the guards, say, why are we still here in solitary? And they'd say, well, how long are people in solitary in Guantanamo? And I remember asking them, we didn't go to trial for 2 years, and said, if you think we're guilty, why don't you take us to trial? And they'd say, well, how long do people wait for trial in Guantanamo? And there, it was this really difficult situation to deal with, because I would say it's like, what do I say to that? I would basically be left saying, well, don't you want to do something better than that? And then there were times where we heard prisoners being beaten. There was one time this man was just so broken, and he was being beaten more, and Josh and I got up and just pounded on the door of our cell, and this guard came running, and he's like, what are you doing? Shut up. And we said, what is this, Guantanamo? And he was really insulted by that, and he was like, how dare you compare this place to Guantanamo, and obviously we were in a place that was really bad, and it was like, I don't necessarily agree with him, but it's like these two kind of situations that are in many ways very similar, kind of like looking at the other one as this kind of example of how bad it is. And when we said that to that guard, they stopped beating this guy.
That's fascinating. Sarah, when we spoke in 2010, when Josh and Shane were still imprisoned, we went back and forth by email a bunch beforehand and then in advance of meeting, where we sort of negotiated about what I should ask you. And there are lots of things you didn't want me to ask about. You were in a very delicate position there, because you weren't just talking to me and the people in the room, you were talking to the president of Iran, among other people.
I just have to say, this is so fascinating to me, because I have no memory of you interviewing me.
Many women feel that way about talking with me.
No, it's not. You don't take it personally, please. It's just there are huge blackouts of that period of my life.
Yeah, well, so I'll remind you then.
Please do.
Which is that, there were lots of subjects you didn't want me to talk about, and I, of course, understood that. Now, this time, thank God, we're in a different position. But I'm very curious now in retrospect, what was going on? You had been warned, for example, by the Omani diplomat who had helped get you out.
Yeah.
Don't talk about certain things. be fair. Don't make them think they made a mistake in letting you out, because then they'll think it's going to be a mistake to let these guys out. What was happening behind the scenes at the time? It was really a sort of a grassroots effort to have these fellows released.
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, I'm the first, I would be the first person to admit that in prison I experienced a degree of Stockholm syndrome. I actually believe that all prisoners experience it to some degree or another. I have a really close friend that was imprisoned here for 20 years, and he said, one of the first times we were hanging out, he said, "Did you have Stockholm syndrome?" I had Stockholm syndrome. He said he had to believe that he deserved to be in prison in order to convince the parole board to let him go. And it wasn't until years after that he said, "Wait a minute, I never deserved to be there." So for me, Stockholm syndrome extended to the outside. At first, it's a rational strategy. You want to please your captors. You want to make them like you so that they'll help you, because they're the ones that have a control. They have the key. They are the ones that will decide whether or not you'll ever be free again. But then it starts to become a part of you, and you can't tell the difference between the strategy and the feelings, and start to become a part of your identity. So when I see some of that footage, when I was still in Iran and they were interviewing me, I hadn't gotten on the plane yet, and I knew that I could still be going back to prison. I mean, I was still in their custody. And I talked about how grateful I was, how humble I felt. And I just kept saying it over again. I feel so humble. I feel so grateful. And I look at that now, and it just makes me so angry, because I had nothing to be grateful for in that point. I never deserved to be in prison one day, let alone to be grateful to be released after 410 days in solitary confinement. So to answer your question, the Omani envoy was, for me, the ticket to Shane and Josh's freedom. So I needed to please him with the media that I was doing. And the media the first few interviews I did, I heard directly from him that President Ahmadinejad approved of my interviews. So you can imagine psychologically, I know that the person that holds the key to their freedom is watching every word that I'm saying. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, well, then, and let's go a little bit beyond those first few days when you were talking to the media. You mentioned you talked to Oprah, then you talked to Hillary Clinton, and you talked to the president. Your families were deeply involved while the three of you were in prison, and then while Josh and Shane were in prison. Can you talk about the efforts, once you returned, and while you were there, frankly, to among people in the United States to secure your release?
Right. Yeah, it was absolutely incredible. I credit our families and our campaign and all of our friends and supporters around the world, many people that still haven't met face to face, for creating a brilliant campaign that just from the very beginning upended this narrative of animosity between countries. I mean, a different family, a different campaign could have been like, let's bomb them. I mean, let's attack Iran, let's make this situation, let's get them out by force, let's send in the troops, right? But from the beginning, our campaign had a beautiful and different strategy. Now, there was still something to overcome, and we didn't really touch on this very much, but in prison, there was a transition that all of us made, the sort of in our own different ways, this sort of arc of how we were as prisoners. And other political prisoners like Zahra and the other women that came in really influenced me, where in the beginning I was begging and I was pleading and trying to get things even through logic. And really we just started to demand and take risks and not act like prisoners, because if you act like a prisoner, you're treated like a prisoner. So when I first came out, I was under this influence of, I need to please these powerful people, and these powerful people hold the key. And then I realized after maybe 6 months of nothing that these powerful people are, pretty distracted and we're not really a priority for them. Our government, there were very simple things that we were asking our government to do, and they were just giving us the runaround month after month after month. And so there was a similar trajectory on the outside where we started to really make demands and come out and basically not take the advice of the diplomats, but speak very strongly against the psychological torture, Shane being beaten, Josh being harassed by guards. And that's when we really, parallel to what happened in prison, that's when we started to get the Iranian government's attention. And I believe that was a key part of our strategy.
Throughout the book, and you just began to touch on this a little bit, but maybe if we can expand for a minute, you don't pull any punches when describing the United States government's effort to try to help you get out. Basically, you describe a government that uses words like priority, but doesn't actually act like you were a priority. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how that makes you feel today, in retrospect, and maybe speculate a little bit about why the government acted the way it did. Let's start with Josh down there, because you're smiling.
Wait, what was the question?
Can you repeat the question? So, the way you discussed how the U.S. government's efforts to get you out with it, they didn't do very much. And so I wonder if you can talk about how that makes you feel, first of all, but secondly, to speculate on why perhaps they acted in the way they did.
Speculate. Well, when I got out, I was so angry at the Iranian government. I mean, it was like, couldn't they just have opened that door 26 months ago? But I didn't feel like I could talk about it that much. I did talk about it, but I didn't feel comfortable talking about it because whenever I did talk about it, someone would be like, okay, well, we should harsher sanctions and maybe we should bomb them. And I was like, yeah, like anger does not equal bombing. Let's get a little nuance. And the U.S., it's been the Oman, Iran decided to give us to release us to the Omani government. They could have released us to the Iraqi government, who was also kind of pushing them about us. They could have released us to the Venezuelan government, who was putting in words for our release. They ultimately released us to the Omani government, which kind of was a signal that, Oman was the channel between the U.S. government and Iranian government. And it then continued after our release to be the channel for sort of clandestine and now public nuclear talks. And for me, what I felt so frustrated by in prison and looking back on it is like, the motion to clear up this past animosity, this attempt to sort of put their sort of I think Sarah writes about it really well in the book about how childish it can be. It's almost like this personal gripe that the American government can have against the Iranian government, the Iranian government will have against the American government. That to put that aside and say okay, start to make concessions and make negotiations for what's happening now. And what I felt was for them, another month, another year, we wait, and another 26 months. And for me, that's 26 months lost in my life. So the pace of politics is so much slower than, it's lagging behind what the people in America want, and it's also lagging behind what the Iranian people want. I mean, they're protesting in the streets, wanting a different government. So, it's frustrating that that it's slow motion, and we don't even know. It could turn into this. Right now, the nuclear agreement is just temporary, and it could, there's people in Congress who are trying to kill it. So, it's hard. Let me give you one example. There were the Belgian guy that you mentioned, as well as there was some German guys on our hall, and they were detained slightly after we were detained for doing. If you think we were hiking near a border, this guy was biking near the a nuclear site in Iran, and they were detained. Yeah, and they were detained, but they were released after 3 or 4 months. The Belgians and the Germans, and I remember watching on television that the foreign minister of Germany was flying to Iran, and then 3 days later, I remember hearing German prisoners to be released back to Germany. And I was like, oh, that's what happens when you have an embassy and when you have normal diplomatic relations. You can do this. So the U.S. didn't have that.
It's not just random that Iran has a beef with the U.S. I mean, this is something that obviously I was frustrated that we were in prison for 2 years personally, but I was more frustrated with this kind of the way that the United States kind of exercises its power in the region. There's been sanctions on Iran for a long time. We overthrew their first democratically elected prime minister. We supported Saddam Hussein in invading Iran. I mean, there's kind of a long legacy of use of force, in Iran, in the whole region. And so I think it shouldn't be, the way that Iran has dealt with this has been very problematic. But it shouldn't be surprising that things like this happen, whether it's us or larger kind of retaliations. And I also think that it's, our situation is unique in many ways, but it's also very common. We had friends before in Syria we had one friend who spent 3 years in prison in Iraq because he happened to meet near a place that there was a bombing and the U.S. troops swept up everyone there, and he was just kind of stuck in limbo, I mean, there's thousands of people that have been caught in this, this battle.
Well, I would say, as much as I was very frustrated with the sort of everything was a non-starter for our government, no matter how small of the thing that we asked. They were unwilling to do it. At one point, just a letter from President Obama to President Ahmadinejad, we had direct information that would have no commitments, just a general letter with kind of fluffy language around hope for a better future and hope for a better relationship between two countries with no guarantees, would have gotten Shane and Josh out of prison, and that was a complete non-starter. So we're not talking about releasing terrorists, we're talking about a letter. As much as I was frustrated with my government, if I'm really honest with myself, to this day, that's politics. Politics are dirty. I don't believe any government is in any way admirable, to be honest. But the thing that I really felt frustrated is what Josh touched upon, is that there is a large portion of the American people that sort of don't find it don't feel responsible for what happens to Americans abroad, and blamed us for even going to the Middle East. Why would you go there if you're not a soldier or if you're not working as a contractor? And that kind of thing I still hear sometimes, and it saddens me, because I think that when a European, for example, is detained in Iran, their government is like, we have to get them out. We have to do something, whatever it takes.
Just a couple more questions, then we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. You guys are very, very close and an extremely powerful support system for each other throughout this ordeal. The flip side of that coin, though, is that you two lived together in a cell for a very long time. And toward the end of the book, there's actually moments of humor where you become sort of like the odd couple, right? And you take a curtain like this and you put it down the center because you just can't live with each other anymore. And as I was reading this, I was thinking, how in God's name did the three of you write a book together? So can you talk about how that process worked?
Let me just say one thing about this scene that you're referring to, because we write about the divider, and then there's another scene where I write about hey Shane, why don't we divide the cell in two, and you go over there and I'll go over here. And then there's another scene a month later, it's my birthday, and it's Shane spending all day using a plastic spoon to chop up nuts so that he can make me a little special pie. And so it's we're in the cell together, and it's I would do anything. When he was having some illness, and that last summer, and he would leave to go to the doctor for hours on end, and I would just be like, oh, this is great. Just having time alone. But at the same time, he was my world. So it's a complex relationship.
Certainly.
I would say, we had a brilliant editor, Eamon Dolan, really extraordinary guy that helped us weave everything together. We all needed space from each other in different ways. Shane and I were living in the same apartment, and we got married and we're sharing our lives together, but we had to learn how to let each other take as much space as we needed at the drop of a hat. Sometimes in the middle of dinner, Shane would just need to go. And Josh moved across the country, and so we had a lot of space. And I think people need that after going through a traumatic experience, because our identities were sort of merged together, and you need to reclaim yourself. And I think space was an important part of our healing.
As far as writing the book, it was hard. It was really hard. It was maybe, outside of being in prison, the second hardest thing I've ever done. And there were times that I just wanted to quit, really, and the times that I thought about it very seriously. But now that I look back on it, there were different moments in writing the book that were just hard personally. There were things that were hard interpersonally between us. When we'd come to parts in the book where there's tension between us, we'd have to deal with that. We'd have to talk about it, write about it, and be like, well, it wasn't exactly that way. And then all of a sudden we're kind of having a similar, argument as we did then, But, now when I look back on that, there's nothing in there. None of those stories, none of those experiences are loaded in the way that they once were. There's one example of something along these lines that there's a point in the book where there's kind of a period where we get into a couple fights with guards, and it was like one after the other. And the second time it happened, we went out to the courtyard and saw Sarah, and I told her that I just got in a fight with the guard, and she got really worried about it, and she was a little bit frustrated with me, and it kind of was this thing where she was afraid that we were going to get separated, and I was like, you should have my back, and it was a really hard moment, and we kind of just got through it and didn't talk about it in prison. And when we got out, it was really hard to talk about that moment, and we were never really able to. And so, but at some point we got there in the book and we had to write about it. So what we did was we sat, two of us in separate rooms in our house. We opened up a Google Doc, and we basically went through the conversation again. Sarah would write a line, then I would write my line, and try to reenact the conversation. And separately, we would have our own documents open, and we'd write our thoughts that are attached to those sentences there. So after we had the conversation, we put the thoughts in, and it was this amazing experience because I was finally able to see, where Sarah, what she was dealing with in that moment, and she had the same experience, and it kind of made us actually be able to move beyond that, and it's not a thing anymore.
Yeah, I mean, one of the many remarkable achievements of this book is how honest you are, despite the fact your closeness, or maybe because of your closeness. You're all extremely honest about how you were feeling about each other at every given moment here. Last question before we open it up. Sarah, while sitting outside in, how do you pronounce it, Havahori? Right, so that's the sort of courtyard where they would let you go out a couple times a day for half an hour.
It means to eat fresh air.
That's a delicacy over there. So while you're sitting out there, you ask Josh and Shane, you say, will we really be free when we're released? You say, once we're released, will we be free? Will we be able to live every moment to its fullest, speak truth to power, and love unconditionally? So, have you been able to do that? And the flip side of that question is, what is each one of you doing right now? So let's start from Josh and come back to Sarah.
Yes, I do that all the time.
Good for you.
Without any hesitation. Now, one of the things I felt that in prison, we had so much time to think, and we'd read books, and we'd just think about stuff, and I felt like I had so many ideals. I was like, I'm going to get out, and when I get out, I shall live them, because it just felt hard to live them in there. And I do. I mean, I keep that as part of me. I try to. When I was stripped of everything in solitary, it's a chance to think about what is important. What relationships are important. Who is important to me, and it helps me think about my own life and think about, there's certain things that, maybe I shouldn't have done. And there's certain things that I feel very proud of. And all that became very clear because the things that I shouldn't have done, I was beating myself over the head about doing them for months on end, and no one to say, like, chill out. It was okay that you didn't, return my email or whatever the little thing was. And so getting out of prison, it's super complex. I mean, when I got out of prison, I sort of like ran into my family's arms. We went to the ocean that night in the Persian Gulf in Oman, and I slept in sheets for the first time in my life. It was like amazing, and but for a long time it felt like my mind was still in prison, and it took a long time to really feel like to not see everybody in terms of simple relationships, that they're either my guard or a fellow soldier, a fellow prisoner, or they're either Shane or Sarah. And to think that, like, wow, there's a lot of different people out here, and it's very complex. It took a while to get to that, and it's been over 2.5 years now. And writing the book I would echo what Shane said about its challenge, but we did it. We closed the back cover last summer, and then after that, I had a baby, and then I moved to Brooklyn, and then I started grad school. So I'm a PhD student in history at NYU. So, moving on and kind of, in some ways it's done and I've past it, but in the other way, it informs kind of me trying to, really prioritize what it means to be alive and what it means to be free, and kind of a continual reckoning with what I reckoned with in there for so long.
Shane.
I don't think that I'm totally free. I mean, I think I'm way, way more free. But I think there's an individual experience of freedom, and I have that in a lot of ways, but I also have to work and, make money and do all this stuff that I don't really want to do. And it, restrains me. But then there's this kind of like much larger sense of freedom, I think, that, when I got out of prison, I was thinking all the time about these people that I left behind. And then I started thinking about all these people that are behind bars here, and then there's all these people that don't really have enough money to eat. They're not really free. So, I think of freedom as a goal, kind of, not really a state of being that I know of that really exists. But it does, I strive towards it, and it's something that informs me and what I do. And since coming back, I've, my work used to focus on the Middle East, my journalism, and I got back here, and there was these big hunger strikes happening in California. There were thousands of people protesting long-term solitary confinement. And I visited one of these prisons, Pelican Bay Prison, found, went inside a cell that was 7 feet by 11 feet that had no windows in it, that people lived in for years, some 30 or 40 years. I met people that had not seen a tree in over a decade. And these were people that didn't necessarily commit violent acts to get there. They were sometimes people who were organizing for better conditions inside prison. And, just after getting into that, I kind of I've always thought a lot about prison since I got out. And coming back here to this place that is my home that I'm very connected to, I've really, thought a lot about how we, as a society, really value freedom, And but we also have more people than any country in the world in prison. And I think that's a major contradiction that we need to grapple with. And I think it's something that is kind of defining our time right now. And so that's kind of, where I'm putting my energies right now as a journalist.
Sarah.
Well, in a way, having my freedom taken from me and not really knowing for sure if or when I would ever get it back, freedom became something so much more important to me, but something that I still could never grasp, could never define. It's like love, right? Or a higher power. How do you actually define that? When I got out, when I dreamed of getting out, I thought, well, as soon as I walk at these doors, I'm going to feel free, I hope. I mean, of course, I had those doubts, is what you pointed out of the book. But one of the most terrifying things was, for me, the only thing harder than getting out of prison was really getting prison out of me. In the early months and years, even, it took years, my body still felt imprisoned. In many ways, my spirit did. And I was afraid that I would walk around in a cell, in my own personal cell, for the rest of my life. You can easily do that in the free world. And for me, it was my mental health, my physical health, the fact that I would react in ways that I didn't feel like me, that I would fly into rages or fly into depressions. I hated it. But luckily, I've healed beautifully. I've had so much love and support, and just really time did the trick. And I think that in many ways, I stay in touch with that desire for freedom, ultimate freedom, whatever it means, as much as I can obtain in my own humble way, by being in touch with prison and prisoners. I identify, I think, more as an ex-prisoner now than I did as a prisoner, because when I was in prison, I didn't want to accept that I was a prisoner. I didn't want to ever take on that identity. I wanted to resist it on every level. But now, when I get a letter, I correspond with dozens of people in solitary across the country, and my work is really fighting against and exposing the brutality of this practice in our own country, in our own backyard. And when I go out and I get a letter from a prisoner, that's often the moment that I feel the most free, because it reminds me of that place. And there's always the contrast that I never have to go back there, but I got a second chance. And so many people don't. And in a really real way, that's what our book is about. It's about the horror of losing freedom and the miracle of getting it back, and all of the people that don't get it back and may never get it back. And that's what makes sense to me on the outside, is fighting for those people.
Thank you. So let's give a round of applause. And I think we're ready to open it up to some questions from the crowd. So folks will be going around with microphones. So raise your hands and they will track you down.
First question is over here on your left.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been fascinating. I wanted to know, when you think about Iran now, what goes through your mind when you think about Iran?
When I think about Iran, I think about the women in Section 209, which I really didn't get much of a chance to talk about. I read about Zahra a little bit, but I think about the women that are still there. And in many ways, when I was in prison, I admired them so much because they were there for their principles. You know, their imprisonment made sense. And the joyful defiance that I witnessed, women passing me notes, risking whatever kind of punishment, and just to tell me that they loved me, just to tell me not to hate Iranians. Women singing down the hallway to me and breaking past the guards to throw their arms around me. Really, that's Iran for me, is those women, their spirit lives inside of me.
Our next question over here to you guys, right?
Yes. I first wanted to compliment all three of you about the wonderful work you've done on yourself emotionally ever since you are freed. Congratulations, and I'm glad that you're all well and wonderful sitting here talking with us. I came here after all these years as an Iranian, as an Iranian Jew, having experienced the life in Iran, and then now having the privilege of being in the United States. The number one reason I came here, to be honest with you, was to find and understand, get a clear picture of what was your information like as three highly educated Americans going to that region to start with. You were in Syria. I know that was your first question asked, and Josh, tried to answer. But I'm still sitting here after the wonderful speech that you all three gave, still unclear. What was your expectation going to that region? Because this is post 9/11, and I apologize if I appear maybe a little bit arrogant in this regard. I'm not of the group saying what were they doing there, but I still am unclear, and I would like to know as close of an answer if it's possible. So you were in Syria, as I understand, and then you decided to go to Iraq or Iraq in the Kurdish. The northern part, whether you had a map with you that day or not, you decided to go hiking there. And to my knowledge, again, as an Iranian Jew, here, the State Department had already, I think, issued, this was a trouble zone in the world. So my question at this point is, was there at any point during your imprisonment, was there anything crossing your mind, some sense of responsibility as to, we shouldn't have done this? So I just want to know how you feel, and also the fact that, that the government has a lot of things to do. Our president.
Thank you.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Do you mean why were we in the Middle East, or why were we in Iraqi Kurdistan, or why did we go to Ahmadawa?
I think all of the above.
You want to know all
Yes.
of it?
Well, yeah, sure. I first went to the Middle East very shortly after 9/11, actually, to the Arab world, and I was very surprised. I went to Syria. It was the first Arab country I went to, and was really surprised at how people made such an intention to they would come to me and say, "I'm so sorry," and I never once had an interaction of hostility. And I came back and I started studying Arabic, and then I lived in the Middle East. I lived in Yemen. I lived in Syria. And that was true throughout that experience. I never had the feeling that I was in a dangerous place just being in the Middle East in general. I felt like Syria, Damascus, was much safer than my hometown of Oakland. And I mean that seriously. And then, in my work, I did go to dangerous places. I went to Baghdad, which is a war zone, and I would go into those, knowing that I was going to a dangerous place and taking every precaution that I could. But going to Iraqi Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, by the time we went there, it had been written up in Vanity Fair and the New York Times. There was, it was on the New York Times top 41 places to visit in the world in 2011 while we were in prison, actually. I would go back there, and I would recommend people to go to Iraqi Kurdistan, actually. I would not recommend them to walk near the border of Iran. But, that was a mistake. To answer your question, I thought about that endlessly. Of course I regretted walking in that area, near the border. The same thing would have happened if we had walked near the border, but we're in Turkey, or in Azerbaijan. This was how the Iranian government reacted to that situation, and they would have done it, regardless of where we were. But, I don't think that this thing happening kind of characterizes the entire region of the world necessarily.
And just briefly, I'd done international solidarity work for years. I lived as an international observer in Chiapas with the Zapatista Revolution, raised funds. So I had a very international perspective for a long time, and I was very involved in the anti-war movement, doing direct action against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And when I met Shane and we fell in love, and he's a fluent Arabic speaker, had traveled around the Middle East, it was instant for me. It was like, oh, let's go. Let's go live in the Middle East, because I loved the Middle East. I'd read so much about it, but I didn't feel I had access. It didn't feel like something I could do on my own because I didn't speak Arabic. And I was also, at the time, teaching ESL, English as a second language, and I had a lot of Muslim students from the region. So I started to learn Arabic, and we saved money. And I found a job in Damascus teaching Iraqi refugees. That were in refugees. There's over 1 million, and many of them were in college in Iraq at the time of the US-led invasion, and their colleges were bombed, shut down, and they're barred from higher education in Syria. So we were helping them get scholarships to continue their education in Europe and America so that they could eventually return to Iraq with an education and help rebuild their country. So it was an extension of my anti-war work to move to the Middle East.
We have time for one final question. Anyone? Okay.
I appreciate your work, your journalistic work addressing American prisons. I once spoke with Seymour Hersh, the great Vietnam War era reporter, he was part of the expose on Abu Ghraib, and so I said, you should connect the situation in Abu Ghraib with the torture and the harassment to American prisons. And he said, oh, no, I won't do that, I won't do that. I said, but, even in places like Chicago, women have been strip searched for, misdemeanor arrest, very low level. He said, oh, you don't have to tell me my brother's a public defender in Chicago. I know all about that. I said, well, why don't you report on that? He said, oh, no, I won't. So I just want to thank you for looking into the situation with American prisons. My question is, I personally think over every airport security line in this country ought to be a sign that says, American foreign policy at work. When I went to the Budapest airport, I was really surprised going from my apartment in Budapest to the airport, that the parking for the airport was right across the street from the main terminal. And I thought, even though the Budapest airport has, magnetometers and stuff like that, I thought, this is what it's like when you're not screwing with so many people that you're worried that they're going to bomb your airport with a truck or whatever. And there's a 2-lane road and, walk from one side to the other. My question for you is, do you ever think about that American foreign policy toward places like Iran with its belligerency and with, frankly, fabrication about nuclear weapons and stuff like that, makes it bad for domestic politics in Iran? Because naturally, when a nation feels it's under attack, whether that's valid or not, they start clamping down on domestic dissent, which makes it much harder for the domestic politics to become more liberal, whether that's with regard to women or other aspects.
Yeah, of course. I think the absolute worst thing for domestic politics in Iran would be is if the U.S. or Israel or any other country bombed Iran. Immediately, right now, the Iranian, and luckily that's not as much of a threat right now, but that could easily change and go back in the direction it's been in for many decades. Right now, the Iranian people are more pro-American as far as culturally, not necessarily the government, I think, than almost any country in the Middle East. And that's constantly what I heard from other prisoners inside. If there was any kind of aggression, direct aggression, everyone would rally behind their government because there's a tremendous amount of pride in Iran, in a national pride, cultural pride, incredibly rich history, incredible literature, film, culture, gives the Iranian people a unique sense of pride that if anyone were to invade their country, they would all rally behind that government. So that kind of answers your question.
Thank you. Oh.
All right. Thank you so much, Josh, Shane, and Sarah. The authors will be signing books just out the door here, and thank you all very much for coming. Good night.